and then welcome to my book corner. We're continuing with our challenged book reads for this year, as well as continuing with our Pride reads for this month as well. This is the second most challenged book in America for 2023. This is the memoir All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. We shall begin by going over the challenge information for 2022 and 2023. And then we'll go into a little bit about what this book is about, and then I'll give my thoughts at the end. So let's dive straight into the bands. So, as I have already mentioned, this is the second most challenged book in the US for 2023, specifically according to the American Library Association. And the reason for that is LGBTQIA plus content, as well as claims for it being sexually explicit. Now, more specifically, as always, I'm pulling from the PEN America Index of School Book Bans for 2022 and 2023. And there's a few here, and you will recognise some of these names. Once again, we have some returning ones. So, the way that I will do this, as always, is I will mention the state. I will then go over the districts within that state that have a ban or a challenge, and the ban status as of this point. So, starting off, and Americans, is it Arkansas or Arkansas, or is it both, or is it neither? Let me know, because I don't know, because I'm British. So I'm going to go with Arkansas. Farmington Public Schools banned from libraries. Then into Florida. Here we go. Escambia County Public Schools, Marion County Public Schools, both banned pending investigation, and the school district of Osceola County, banned from libraries and classrooms. Volusia County Schools banned from libraries. In Idaho, you have another familiar name in the Kuna School District, where it's banned pending investigation. In Michigan, you have the Sheboygan area schools banned from classrooms, and Dearborn Public Schools banned pending investigation. North Carolina, you have Beaufort County School District banned pending investigation. On to Texas, you have Belton Independent School District, Conroe Independent School District, Frisco Independent School District, Humble Independent School District, and Keller Independent School District. In all those, they are banned from libraries and classrooms, with the exception of Humble, where it is only banned from libraries. On to Utah, and again, familiar names here. Alpine School District, banned from libraries and classrooms. Same for Davis School District as well. Into Virginia, you have Hanover County Public Schools and Spotsylvania, what an amazing name, County Public Schools, both banned from libraries and classrooms. And finally, into Wisconsin, you have the School District of Somerset, where it's banned pending investigation. And what I find interesting glancing through the origin of the challenges is this is a mix of multiple challenge types, including but not limited to legislative action and administration challenges as well. So, a fair few challenges in there. But what is the book about? So this is a life story, or the early part of George's life specifically. Runs from childhood up until around the point where George leaves college, or as we call it in the UK, university. So around 21 years of age. And George was born in 1985. So George is growing up throughout his life in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And this book covers a number of different aspects of growing up. The exploration of identity, be that general identity, societal identity, gender identity, or sexual identity, and all those things are covered here, and the challenges that faces. And what this does a really good job of touching on very quickly is the idea of how you're seen by society and sort of tried to force to be fitted in to a certain mold. And this starts very early on, with the idea of the importance of names, which is something that we don't really think about very often. I know I certainly never have. And the fact of how much influence does your name have on you? And the point that George makes in the book is, well, the first thing that happens is it reinforces the gender identity, and therefore straight away it adds several layers of assumption there as a default assumption, which is not necessarily accurate. And it goes through various points where George is considering switching between their first and their middle name as their preferred identifying name, and the difficulties of that, and the origins of George's names as well is covered here, which I find really fascinating to think about, the effects of naming has on a child's early development, and in fact, not just early development, but development in general, because our names are such an intrinsic part of who we are. And it's just a fascinating thing to think about, but it also touches on, the various other challenges that they faced growing up. Growing up as a young black kid in America in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s as they make their way towards adulthood. The idea of exploring sexuality and sexual identity for the first time, gender identity as well, and what that potentially can look like. And it reinforces this with the idea of the direction that George is naturally pulled in, and the direction that society and cultural history, I suppose, to a point, is pulling as well. And what I really like about this book is the focus on family. And something that they talk about within the writing is how lucky that George was with the family that they had. A loving, caring family. Even, as mentioned in here, like the dad is an example of someone who is not affectionate but still radiates love and a lack of judgment. And that's important, because something that George mentions in the book is that as they began to realise they were slightly different to some of the people around them, and over time realised that it's because they were queer, there was still never any judgment from family. And apparently, and I don't know how true this is, so someone can tell me if this is true or not, apparently there is a much bigger pushback within the black community against being queer than not being. Now, I don't know how true that is, but that's certainly something that's mentioned in here, and the lack of support within the black community for queer black kids, if that's true, is horrifying. I mean, the lack of support in general is horrifying, just for anybody who wants to be themselves, but that is really sad. That's the best way I can put it. Now, obviously, times have moved on, but we're not there yet. And this does acknowledge the difficulties of growing up in the 80s and 90s. This talks about slurs and having to make the compromise to try and fit in. Why do you try and fit in? To keep yourself safe. And that is reinforced right at the start of the book, because the very first chapter of the book is called Smile. Now, there's an introduction which is surprisingly meaty for a book introduction, actually. And then the first true chapter is called Smile. And the first line of Smile, and it links into the cover of the book as well, is, "I was 5 years old when my teeth got kicked out. It was my first trauma." No kid should have the teeth kicked out at 5. And this is by older kids as well. I think they were 9, 10 years old, if I remember, considerably older. And it's horrific. And the reason that George isn't smiling is that after that, because the teeth have been kicked out, they felt so self-conscious. There's a body image thing going on there about smiling. And it became a thing where when George did smile, it was a truly magical moment. And this book is full of fascinating characters. The one that I think is the most inspirational being Nanny, who just seems like an absolute angel of a woman. Just so full of love and kindness that everybody, and again, something George mentions themselves, everyone needs someone like that in their life. I was lucky enough that I had a family figure like that in my life growing up as well. And it makes such a difference because it gives you a little bit of confidence to be a little bit more who you are and be a bit more accepting as well. Because the one thing that does force people backwards into themselves is the judgment of others. And if the people closest to you are not judging, then you can flourish. This does talk slurs, though. And one of the reasons that potentially this is banned is because of the use of slurs within the book. Now, what I will say is I don't think any of the slurs are used inappropriately in here, and it is worth mentioning that they're not always shown in full. It does depend on the text in which they are sitting in. But it does use the F slur. It does use the N word on occasion as well. Obviously, the word queer is also used in here. And it's used in an interesting way because it is talking about the reclamation of language in particular. Because when I was growing up in the 90s, the term queer was an insult. You know, it was derogatory. Now it's been embraced by LGBTQ community and is used as an identifying label for people that don't quite fit under some of the other labels or aren't quite sure yet where they fit indeed. And it talks about reclaiming language, but also hints that maybe not all language should be, which I find really interesting, especially when you look at the history behind certain words. Some should perhaps be assigned to the dustbin of history and left there and never used again. And it covers then all the trials and tribulations, and it celebrates the great moments, but it doesn't shy away from the stumbles either. This covers, unfortunately, sexual assault and child molestation. And it's a sign, I think, of how jaded I am, at least at this point, that as I was reading through the book, I kind of expected something to be worse than it was. And when I stop and look at what I read and what I was thinking of, I'd expected this to be worse. That doesn't make what happens in the book even remotely acceptable, like at all, because it is sexual assault of a minor. And yet somehow I'd expected something worse. And that's kind of the thing here, because there's an expectations level of what words mean. And again, it's words are the key with a lot of this. When you say certain words, what is the thing that comes to mind? And it lessens the impact of what many people see as less serious incidents within that spectrum. They almost get dismissed. And it's important to remember that they shouldn't be. This is a talk about age appropriate and consent and abuse as well. So, really, really powerful book. And it is split into 4 chapters. The first one being Act 1, A Different Kid. And this is obviously the early years of growing up. Starting with the fact when their teeth got kicked out. And then looking at the idea of George being slightly different to the people around them. And the first sort of identifiers of identity itself, personal identity. And then the lies that history tells us, that, or at least the conceits that we use to teach history, because we tend to wipe out the bad bits we don't want to remember. And that's really important that we don't do that, because you don't learn from history if you don't tell the full history. Specifically in this case, talking about Abraham Lincoln. After The Different Kid, it goes into Act 2 and it's talking about family, talking about dad and nanny in particular are big focuses, and mum as well. Before going into the teenage years, you know, your high school and middle school, and when you really begin to discover who you are and also who you're attracted to and how big a deal that is. Before finally hitting friends, when you're going away for the first time, you go into university or college, and you can really begin to express yourself a little bit more, in theory at least, because the shackles of family and home community are kind of thrown off a bit, because that supervision's kind of gone and you can truly start to be who you are. And it goes into like the frat culture, which is a thing that we don't really have here in the UK anywhere near as strongly at any rate. And the ideas of loss and, again, historical expectation with like the frat houses and stuff like that. And it is a really interesting, fascinating and powerful book to read through. And it ends on a sad note and a hopeful note at the same time, as it deals with loss of people close to you, but also kind of found family in a way, the importance of good friendships. And it's really heartwarming. Taken in a vacuum, I can understand why people would challenge this book. If I was to go up to anyone and say, there's a book in the school library and it has a child being molested, it has racial and sexual slurs in there, it has sexual acts written in it as well, most people would go, get it out of the library now. But that is the simple facts. The complicated facts is it's all in context of a life story. And what people don't like to consider is the fact there's people still going through these sorts of things now. And the one thing that people going through such horrific life events have in common is that they feel so isolated and alone, and often so wrong because of shame. Because they're told that they're different and different is bad. And the thing is, we have this dangerous notion of normal. And I don't like the word normal in general anyway, because I don't think there is such a thing, because everyone is so amazing and unique. And if you take books like this out of a library, you're taking hope away from certain people. Because if you're someone who is going through similar things that George went through, and you feel so isolated and so alone because you're the only person this has ever happened to in your own head, and then you read this book, you come across this and you read it, it's that spark of hope, it's that spark of validation that some people need to get them through. And for that, I love this book, because it's so hopeful. It is the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not afraid to not so much embrace, but talk about the darker side of things, the concessions sometimes that people incorrectly have to make, or feel like they should make, because they want to be accepted, because everybody kind of wants to be accepted by people around them. Nobody wants to be alone, not really. And I think that's a very powerful thing, to acknowledge the light, but the cost sometimes of getting there, but it's still worth it. And this book is a sort of title that will give hope to people and will potentially pull them through. Now, do I agree with everything in this book? No. There's cultural differences between the UK and the US, and obviously my life experiences are going to be incredibly different to George's growing up. And that's going to give different viewpoints. And obviously I'm coming from a viewpoint where I have to acknowledge it, white privilege. You know, it's something that I do need to be mindful of. And the stuff in here, from a cultural point of view, that baffles me, because it's stuff that I don't know or haven't come across. And it's had me going and investigating and looking at things, because I've seen it in other books as well, written by Black authors, talked about certain things, and it's something that I've never knew was a thing. It's something I've never come across, I've never seen, and it's kind of highlighted my own personal ignorance. But that did make the book a difficult read for me personally, because a lot of the cultural touchstones are so different to what I'm used to. Hi, this is Ven from the future. I just want to do a shout out to the amazing Jaleesa over at Reading Beyond the Book Cover, who very kindly did a sensitivity watch for me on this video. And the thing that she said to me was to maybe talk a little bit about what the cultural differences are that kind of interrupted my ability to interact with this. And the thing is, that's quite a difficult thing to do, because they're not necessarily obvious at first glance, because there are a lot of similarities between US and UK culture, but it's stuff that's just slightly off kilter, right? There's some things I can easily point at. So the education system in the US and the UK is very, very different, and it's geared to a different sort of approach to education. Over there, it's a lot more competitive than it is here. In fact, the school system in general feels more competitive and more individualistic in many regards, with the focus being on individual excellence rather than the collective. Whereas UK schools are more aimed at uniformity and getting everyone to fit within a broad set of acceptability in terms of skills and behaviours. And I mentioned the thing to do with competitiveness because of the sports situation over there, especially in like your high schools and your colleges and your varsity sports, I suppose I think you call them. And we don't have that here. We have school competitions. They're just seen as a little bit of fun over here. There's no competition to it, not really. There is when you get into professional sports, but under that, not really a thing. So there's a mentality difference there. But when you pull away from that, you then have some slightly more vague differences. So the idea of individualism versus collectivism. The UK, whilst I would argue it is less community spirited than the US in many regards, it does have more focus on community versus individual. There is a lot more about thinking about what you can do for the group around you rather than your own excellence. Now, that's not to say that community here is close. It's actually not. And I feel like US, or at least certain communities within the US, have that boiled down a lot better. For example, with things like your housing associations over there that force like the neighbourhoods to work together and stuff, which is just a baffling idea to me. And also, not education, religion. And I mention religion specifically, number one, because it comes up in the book talking about Catholic school and working for church missions. But the UK is really not very religious anymore and has fallen very much by the wayside in terms of religious community. It's not a thing, really. To put it in perspective, in the US, 68% of the population identify as some form of Christian. In the UK, it's only 46%. And then when you go to the group that have no religious affiliation, the US is 21%, the UK is 37%. So one of the sort of big community drivers of the last couple of thousand years in the church isn't as prevalent here to drive that community, which is something that's worth bearing in mind because historically that's the thing that fetches people together. On top of that, though, you have like the basic difference in terms of what you'd call, I suppose, behaviours and etiquette. Because, again, there is a very deserved reputation for the UK being polite, quite standoffish, a lot more subdued, a lot more cynical, and a lot less optimistic as well. Whereas the US appears to be a lot louder, a lot more brash, a lot more individual focused on individual excellence, to be a lot more positive. You know, throwing positivity at a Brit is like throwing an egg against a wall. It just does not work particularly well, which is interesting as well because the encouragement here has never really been you can do whatever you want to do. But the slightly more vague one comes to interaction, community interaction, and specifically my ability to interact with the black community here in the UK. And I'm saying that because there's a very different status quo here in terms of your ethnic mix here. So again, for perspective, in England, well, no, actually, no. I live in Greater Manchester, which is the 5th most diverse city in the UK. With 51% of Manchester's population identifying as one of the ethnic minorities, so one of the non-white groups, which is high by UK standards. Especially when you consider the overall picture of the UK. Now, I live on the outskirts, so where I live actually is more endemic of the national average. So 81% of people in England identify as white, with 9.6% Asian or Asian British, and only 4.2% as black, Black British, Caribbean or African. Compare that to the US, only 61.3% identify as white, with 18.5% Hispanic and around 12.4% identifying as black. And that's nearly 3 times as large a percentage of the population as it is here in the UK. I just don't see as many people of colour because of where I live, and because it's a much smaller percentage of the population. So I don't have that interaction to act as a cultural touchstone. And on top of that as well, speaking of cultural touchstones, the interesting thing as well, looking at the data, is that people in the UK tend to identify as British first, and then any other ethnic identifiers second, which then falls into language, with 95% of the UK having English as a first language. Flip that to the US, and again you have a very different sort of picture, with English being the first language for 78% of the population, which is a massive difference. And when you look at ethnic identifiers, it tends to be based more on historical heritage than nationality, which I find fascinating, especially when you consider the idea that American schools look a lot more nationalistic than they do here. And none of these are necessarily major shifts in perspective, but they're just off enough, as I was reading, for me to not quite grasp some of the things. It's a big example of a thing that really threw me, and I actually find horrific, to be honest. And I've seen this in oh god, what have I seen it in? I've seen it in this book, I saw it in Blood at the Root, and I think I've come across it in Black Flamingo, which I'm currently reading as well. Is a thing. In fact, no, it wasn't Black Flamingo. I can't remember what book it was. I've come across it in 3 books anyway. A thing about touching hair. And Jaleesa very kindly explained this to me, because this just blew my mind. Because here in the UK, because of the polite nature of society, and I'm using polite with a grain of salt, but it's a lot more standoffish. Personal space is a massive thing here. The idea of someone going up to anybody and just touching them, regardless of where it is, they'd get headbutted, like realistically, or at the very least threatened. It's almost unthinkable. It's not something you really see. So when I first read it in Legendborn, it really threw me, the touching of the hair thing, because it's something that I've never seen, I've never come across. People will compliment hair, but it never goes past that, because it's very much a surface level compliment that's used as a generic, almost like, oh, you look good, your hair's nice, isn't it sunny today, isn't that good? It's very generic and not individualized. But the idea of just touching is baffling to me. And the fact that that's a thing, just, I don't get it. I don't understand. Keep your hands to yourself until you ask permission and you're given it, because that's how the world works. And Jaleesa went into a bit more detail about some of the histories around that, some more of the information as well, which I really appreciated, because it added a level of context that I was very strongly missing. And that is kind of what it is with the book, because my lived experiences are so different because of how slightly off-kilter the two cultures are to each other. I don't have the same touch points to be able to grapple onto things. So, thank you for Jaleesa for the suggestion. I hope what I've just said kind of makes sense. It was a little bit rambling, a little bit unfocused. But back to the original video. But I definitely don't think this should be banned. But that's my thoughts on All Boys Aren't Blue, the second most challenged book in America in 2023. Have you read this? What did you think about it? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please consider dropping a like and a subscribe if you're not already. It really helps the channel out. I'll see you next time.